History is written by the victors, and where is our history, young people? We know nothing about our history. Islamic history is the only civilization that the victors couldn't write. If there are weak and fabricated accounts, who fabricated these weak ones? Who fabricated these accounts? Because Islamic history was never a product of power, nor a relic of power, nor an institution within the institutions of power. And here I welcome the electronic flies online trolls, and bring your blood pressure monitors with you, because measure your blood pressure and we will answer this question for you. I don't know where your red lines are. We are coming. The Umayyad state was a single caliph sitting in Damascus, ruling from China to France. Beware of the Orientalists. Who are these Orientalists? They took manuscripts from our lands, catalogued them, verified them, and thus preserved them from being lost. Welcome, my brothers, wherever you are. Lovers of history in particular, and history enthusiasts as well. In the second episode of the 100 Questions in History Podcast, part of the Our History Podcast, with our regular guest is Professor Mohammed El-Harni. This is the second episode. Welcome, and we will answer a number of questions that are raised here and there, which fall within the context of the pressing question. Question for Professor Mohammed: does history mean that history is written by the victors? Yes, and therefore, we Muslims, when we were victorious, wrote history. Other nations, when they were victorious, also wrote history. So, does this statement affect the narrative or history in general? In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, and peace and blessings be upon the messenger of God. Of course, I reiterate my thanks for this invitation, and I repeat my prayer that God Almighty makes this work purely for His noble countenance. Amen. Beautiful words. The statement that history is written by the victors. Well, it is true that history is written by the victors, but this sentence is incomplete. We can complete it by saying that history is written by the victors as long as they are victorious. What is the disagreement surrounding this? What made people say that history is written by the victors? They see that any victor, any conqueror, any powerful person, whenever they seize the seat of power, authority, or empire, writes their version of history. Now, let me give you a simple example. If a revolution succeeds, what will it be? A great revolution, a blessed revolution, or the revolution that established the republic? And if it fails, what will it be? A rebellion, a terrorist movement, a civil disobedience, a riot. It's perfectly natural that when a revolution triumphs, it will present its narrative to history what injustices existed in the previous era, what drove the revolution's leaders to plan, orchestrate, and execute this revolution, and after their victory, how will they proceed in this government on the path of reform, liberation, and independence, a path contrary to what the old defunct regime did. Now, if the revolution fails, the existing authority will present its narrative about this terrorist movement, claiming that these terrorist groups who attempted to overthrow the government, threaten social peace, and undermine the state's achievements were foreign agents. The victor must present their narrative to history, otherwise their victory will be meaningless. In other words, if the one who carried out the revolution doesn't present their narrative to history, then what was the point of the revolution? Their revolution was, in fact, an act of lawlessness. They must present their narrative. His version of history is good. In reality, there are two ways to write history that align with the victor's perspective. The first way is that the victor himself writes history. You have the press, the media, educational curricular, films, television series, and even the online trolls on social media. All these are tools used to write the victor's version of history. Another factor is that when you achieve victory, the vanquished, the one who was defeated, is impressed by your triumph. They See lessons to be learned. From it, victory isn't easy, it's not a matter of chance. There's planning, courage, and sound judgment involved. No victory happens by mere chance. Therefore, the vanquished, the one who triumphed, also tries to write this history, drawing on the victor's narrative. They might do so with understanding, but they might also genuinely admire the victor because they are victorious and influenced by the narrative produced by the victor. So, there are two ways to write history: the victor writes, and the vanquished, impress, also writes the victor's history. Okay, that's clear. What I've just said is what makes people say that history is written by the victors, and therefore this history contains a degree of falsification, a degree of ignoring flaws and problems, and a degree of avoiding other truths that the victors don't want to acknowledge. Then, the group that promotes this saying says, even if this is true, it will only last for a limited period because, in the end, the victor doesn't remain victorious forever. Another state will come and defeat him, and time will turn against him, and his state will fall. So, the people in the new state will dig up his history and bring out the flaws, and they will also dig up the history of the state that came before them and bring out its virtues. Therefore, history is more powerful than the victor. For example, in Egypt, Muhammad Ali established the Alawite dynasty, which is what is called the founding of modern Egypt. No one could write anything about Muhammad Ali during his time that contradicted his narrative, but when Nasser came and removed Muhammad Ali's dynasty and declared the Republic, historians reconsidered. Not that they re-examined, but rather they did it, and the opportunity arose for Ahmed Orabi to become an Egyptian hero and the leader of the first liberation attempt, even though it failed and led to the British occupation. Ahmed Orabi remained cursed throughout Muhammad Ali's reign, but when the Republic came and Muhammad Ali's state fell, Ahmed Orabi's name and the Orabi Revolution were rehabilitated. So, these others say that the victor doesn't remain victorious forever. History is stronger than all victors. In the end, another victor comes and rewrites the victor's history. Therefore, if we want to correct this statement, we say that history is written by the victor as long as he is victorious. Then history unfolds, unearthing everything that was buried, extracting everything that was hidden, and publishing everything that was concealed. But here I must say something. We were talking in the previous episode about Islamic history. One of the surprises is that, as far as I know, Islamic history is the only civilization that the victor couldn't write, a unique exception among us. Some of them are from us, some of them are from us, and some of them are from us. Now, let me tell you a very simple example. A conflict broke out among the companions, may God be pleased with them all. In this conflict, Ali and Muawiyah were practically victorious. So, whose state was established and continued, Ali or Muawiyah? Now, how many people in the entire Islamic world consider Muawiyah superior to Ali? If there are any, the number is negligible. Ali, who was defeated on the battlefield and whose state was not established, is considered superior by the masses of Muslims due to their great pride to Muawiyah, the victor who established a state, and a great one at that. He didn't establish a weak state, he established a very great state. That's why, for example, Imam Ibn Hajar said that he doesn't know of any companion with more authentic chains of narration praising Ali than Ali. Ali is the companion with the most authentic chains of narration praising him. This is because people needed to narrate them since many Hadiths were narrated about him during Muawiyah's time, during the time of the state, the Umayyads, and what days they were after the Abbasid state, because the Abbasid state also persecuted the Alawites. Well, this is the only case in history, my friend, where the defeated remained more elevated, higher, better, and more esteemed in the minds and consciences of the masses than the victor. The same thing happened during the Abbasid era. Now the Abbasids triumphed over the Umayyads, and during the Abbasid period, some wrote about the flaws of the Umayyads, and some wrote to criticize them. Yet now, when we evaluate the Umayyad state, what did it do? I mean, now the prevailing opinion among most historians is that the Umayyad state was better in every way than the Abbasid state in terms of military strength, in terms of Islamic unity, in terms of geographical expansion, in terms of the ability to manage these vast lands. The Umayyad state had one caliph sitting in Damascus ruling from China to France, something tremendous that America cannot do now with all its technology. One person sitting in Damascus, and Islamic unity was not repeated after the Umayyad state, not in the state. The Abbasid Caliphate was always in areas outside the control of the caliph, where the prince held sway. The main point I want to make is that Muslims are a people among whom power has not been able to triumph over science and knowledge, as happens throughout the world. For example, the Umayyad and Abbasid states arose, yet you won't find in authentic hadiths praising Muawiyah or Abbas, the heads of these two great states, as much as you find praising Ali, may God be pleased with him. Here, I'd like to point to important books that explain how history in our region wasn't written by the victors, and how the scientific, cultural, and intellectual landscape wasn't influenced by power in the way it is in other parts of the world. There's a very good book called The Hadith Scholars and Politics by Dr. Ibrahim Al-Ajlan, may God preserve him. It's a 900-page book that discusses the idea that these hadith scholars were working for the benefit of the ruling power, flattering it, or fabricating and promoting hadiths to serve that power. The Hadith Scholars and Politics is a book. After finishing 900 pages, you realize that everything said about this accusation is utter nonsense. There's nothing like it. There's a slightly smaller book by Dr. Ahmed Sanaubar, may God preserve him, called Political Authority and the Narration of Hadith. He focuses on the virtues of Ali, specifically the hadiths concerning his merits and those of Muawiyah, comparing them in authentic books and the widespread transmission of hadith chains. It immediately becomes clear that the man who, according to the materialistic standards of the materialists, is defeated is the one whose virtues fill the hadith collections, may God be pleased with him. Meanwhile, the man who, according to the materialistic standards, triumphed, did not have the same merit and stature as Ali, may God be pleased with him. There's also a book called The Political Interpretation of Doctrinal Issues by Dr. Sultan al-Amiri. This book refutes the accusation that the group, meaning the Sunnis, or that they only triumphed, or that Islamic doctrine, when written, was written according to the victorious side. This book is also significant in this regard and offers further details. There are other books that are more precise and specialized than the three I mentioned. Countries mentioned them, but the evidence these books stand as clear proof that in the Islamic world, neither doctrine nor history was written according to the whims of the victors, of course, in the Islamic context. Otherwise, I'll give you an example. Professor Muhammad, I was in Cordoba. When you read, of course, the history of the Battle of Hattin on the plain of Hattin, the details, the size of the armies, the reasons for the battle, and so on, in our sources, then you go to Cordoba specifically, house of governance opposite the mosque, which belonged to Abd al-Rahman Roman III, I think Abd al-Rahman al-Nasser. You go to the second floor, and as soon as you enter, they recount the whole story of the Battle of Hattin. They've made a large library and so on. So I look at what's written and try to translate it, because it's in Spanish, and the library there you say in Cordoba theirs talk about Hattin, or talk about the conquest of Hattin. Hattin tells you one story after another about an event that happened to us. The original account is that we are the ones who tell it because we were the victors. So I said, let me see. He, Kamzo, saw the narrative from his own perspective. The truth is, there's a great deal of consistency and an unusual fairness to Saladin. They wrote, the clever man, meaning a man, not just anyone. Also, when you look at the other side, we lost Andalusia. What's your concern as the victor? We as Muslims have now written with complete impartiality what happened to us and how we lost them kingdom by kingdom, region by region. So from our perspective, we are reassured by this statement. History is written by the victor, but we are not reassured by this statement when it comes from the other side, right? In the way we mentioned, it's the natural human condition that history is written by the victor, by the victorious power throughout the world, throughout history. From the beginning, when history was written on obelisks, the pharaoh would come and write the history he wanted on the obelisk, and then the one after him would come and perhaps destroy the obelisk, perhaps replace the inscriptions, perhaps write another history. But I repeat, because Islamic history specifically wasn't originally a product of the ruling power, nor did it bear any trace of it, nor was it an institution within the institutions of power. Islamic history was written to serve, regulate, protect, and understand the religion. It was independent of the ruling power, and because the scholarly environment was not controlled by the ruling power, the influence of the ruling power on the writing of Islamic history was minimal. I don't need to say it again and again. He doesn't want to understand that our history is angelic. He doesn't want anyone to understand that all of our history is true. He doesn't want to understand that we didn't have pioneers, liars, and fabricators. All of that exists. We are human. But the overall result, the final outcome of our Islamic history, is that it wasn't written according to the winds of the ruling power. The proof of this is that we see a number of the defeated who remained the most brilliant and shining in the conscience of the nation. And what about the victors? They were criticized and condemned as being wrong because their victory wasn't considered. The victor didn't see that. The writer of history didn't see that so-and-so's victory leads to a weakening of the. For example, the hadith, like the prophets saying, peace and blessings be upon him, the famous hadith, the mutawatir hadith, a rebellious group will kill him, and Amr will be killed by a rebellious group, and Amr was
ما حصلش هنا انه في كتبة للدولة الأموية استطاعوا أن يطاردوا هذا الحديث أو أن يكذبوه أو أن يحذفوه أو أن يدفنوه. ما حصلش. ظل الحديث موجودا.
killed by Muawiyah's group. It is established among all Muslims that Muawiyah was the rebellious group, even though he was the one who triumphed. It didn't happen that the Umayyad states' books were able to suppress, deny, delete, or bury this hadith. It remained, and the nation continued to adhere to it, believing that Muawiyah was wrong, even though he later established a great state. May God be pleased with all the Prophet's companions. Okay, for example, I want to tell you that because of the saying history is written by the victors, there are schools that emerged in Western academies, schools that try to read history from the perspective of the vanquished. These are called the history of the vanquished, the history of the marginalized, history from below, the history of the dependent, the history of the periphery. All these expressions ultimately mean the same thing. What is history from the perspective of those who were not victorious? This school of thought, for example, has begun to try to glorify, that is, to present the other narrative of the victor's history. Of course, these are Western schools, and they have made efforts in this area, and many peoples who were occupied have benefited from them because they awakened the voices that the foreign occupiers didn't speak. Even this example, that our Islamic history didn't sympathize with the victors and sympathized with the vanquished, I would still say, no, Islamic history followed a scientific approach in which it didn't side with either the victors or the vanquished, because you have another group, for example, like the Kharijites, who rebelled against Ali and killed him, and then rebelled against the Umayyad state and were defeated. Some of them remain in the Abbasid state and were defeated. Islamic history doesn't glorify the Kharijites because they were ideal, pure, and obedient, praying, fasting, and performing night prayers. The Kharijites were indeed like that. Islamic history didn't glorify the Kharijites because they were ideal, nor did it glorify them because they were defeated. I'm telling you, history, the Islamic approach was one of neutrality, neither favoring the victor nor the vanquished. This is one of the main reasons for our confidence, or rather, for the fact that Islamic history, compared to the histories of other nations, is the most reliable historical record overall. There are details to discuss, investigations to be made, and specifics to consider, but it was Professor Muhammad who caused this phrase to spread, let me say, virally recently, especially on social media and elsewhere. He tells you, brother, history is written by the victor. Every time you bring up a topic, he says history is written by the victor. And for your information, Britain wrote all our history, our entire region, or the French, or whoever. The idea that this phrase is spreading so widely is a product of colonialism, and it's starting to grow among us. So the person telling you this is implying that our history isn't accurate. Yes, history is written by the victor, but who is the victor who colonizes us today? So, where is our history? Young people, history? We don't know anything about him. That's exactly what's on social media. Yes, well, I'm saying that, initially, if you want to take this rule, the rule that history is written by the victors, this rule itself, keep in mind, is a critical rule of the victor's history. It's a rule that shouldn't be accepted. Who said that history is written by the victors? Someone who didn't like the history written by the victors said it right. Or if they liked it, they would have said, this is history, and that's it. So, this statement applies to every historical movement in the world, but with the addition of as long as the victor is victorious, because after the victor is gone, others come and write his history and try to revive what he wanted to hide, suppress, and bury. So people who object to this statement say, no, history is stronger than the victor because history is longer than the victor, and history endures longer than the victor. No victor remains victorious forever. Therefore, history retains its value and its enduring ability to address the setbacks that have occurred. In those days, the victor was completely victorious, but we Muslims have another advantage. Our history, when it was written, wasn't written in the corridors of power, nor was it written according to the will of the victor. Rather, our scholarly environment was less influenced by power and more independent of it. All the sciences that emerged from it were free from the influence of power, including history. And I repeat, this is the general result and the overall picture. However, we did have narrators and historians who wanted to flatter the authorities, who wanted to fabricate hadiths, who wanted to compile historical hadiths. The rest of the scholars stood against them, considering that we as a civilization
يقول لك ايه الراجل ده ينبذ يقول لك كان يأتي السلاطين وكان يداخل السلاطين وكان يقف بباب السلاطين. دي عمرها ما كانت مثلبة في أي مكان تاني وفي أي حضارة تانية. أنت دلوقتي لما تسمع عن مؤرخ يستقبله رئيس الجمهورية، دي حاجة تخليه يرتفع في نظر
need a Salafi to rise, not just
بدها سيلفي معه مش بس يرتفع. صدقت، هو ده اللي بيحصل فعلا.
rise. Believe me, that's what actually happens. We are the civilization that used to see someone going to the Sultan's gate, and this person would criticize him, and we would keep arguing about him. We would wonder, when he went to the Sultan's gate, did he retain his religion, his faith, and his precision, so we could take knowledge from him? Or would this cause disagreement among people? But this doesn't happen anywhere else. Imam al-Zuhri of the Diwan of Islam, one of the most important narrators, Muhammad ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, a great scholar. So, what was Muhammad ibn Shihab al-Zuhri's relationship with Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik? He was with Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, and later with al-Walid ibn Abd al-Malik. Then Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan passed by and suggested to him that he was lying, or that people like him were lying. This scholar was telling Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, the ruler of the world at that time, "Woe to you, by God, even if an angel descended from heaven and proclaimed that God had permitted lying, I would not lie." No one doubted that Muhammad ibn Shihab al-Zuhri was a liar. Then a funny incident happened when someone like al-Mustashi, or rather, Zuhair, a well-known scholar who wrote books on the science of hadith, accused Muhammad ibn Shihab al-Zuhri of wanting to flatter Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan by narrating hadiths about the virtues of the rock. He told you is that this rock, the dome of the rock, was built by Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, and the mosque was built as a substitute for the pilgrimage to Mecca. This was because Mecca at that time had Abd al-Malik's rival, Abdullah ibn al-Zubair, so he wanted to draw people away from making the pilgrimage to Mecca and from supporting Abdullah ibn al-Zubair, so they would make the pilgrimage to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, hadiths began to be fabricated, meaning that hadiths were started to be spread and requested to be fabricated about the virtues of the rock and the virtues of traveling to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And who is accused of doing this? Who is Muhammad ibn Shihab al-Zuhri? Of course, look, because I told you that Islamic history has evidence and mechanisms for examining it. Muslim scholars addressed it. Among the most famous of them, as I recall now, was Sheikh Mustafa al-Sabay, may God have mercy on him, in his book The Sunnah and its Place in Islamic Legislation, and among them was Sheikh Muhammad Mustafa al-Azarni in his book The Methodology of Criticism Among Hadith Scholars. They proved that Muhammad ibn Shihab al-Zuhri did not meet Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan except in the year 80 or 822, about 7 years after the battle with Abdullah ibn al-Zubair and Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan's conquest of Mecca. But what made Goldziher think this way? Because he was a Westerner who viewed Islamic history like European history and other histories. He encountered someone who narrated a hadith about the virtue of traveling to the Dome of the Rock, and they applied the political framework in his mind, the framework of his culture. He said, naturally, a famous narrator was present at the court of a king, and this king was in conflict with another. So this hadith was just one of the things that intellectuals, elites, and academics present to politicians. But of course, it appeared. Now, does this mean that no one thought of flattering Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan and fabricating hadiths about the virtue of the Dome of the Rock? No, there are well-known and weak hadiths that were fabricated about the virtue of the Dome of the Rock. They are known and marked as weak to this day. So I'm telling you, our Islamic history was written in a way and with a methodology that enables you to test it and examine the narrations. The information contained in this is not available to any other nation. That's why reason, analysis, prediction, imagination, and deduction enter the historian's mind, while he lacks such an ability to examine. You know, when you find information side by side and you can't distinguish between them. So, what do? You try to piece it together with your mind. But this statement cannot be taken or circulated in a fragmented way. Yes, history is written by the victor as long as he is victorious. Do not approach prayers like that on its own. Exactly. Yes, okay, I will move on to the fifth question, Professor Muhammad. The fifth question is that many people, researchers, thinkers, whoever they may be, repeat the statement that Islamic history contains authentic and fabricated material. Therefore, if there is weak and fabricated material, who created the weak material? Who created the fabricated material and why? What do they want? Beautiful, may God bless you. We said that we Muslims, or rather, we Muslims, are human beings. We Muslims are human beings, and therefore, just as there are good people among us, there are bad people among us, and just as there are truthful people among us, there are liars among us. Just as some people are disciplined, others are confused. Just as some people have strong memories, others have weak ones. They are human. So, for example, in the current turmoil surrounding the dispute over Hezbollah, Sunnis and Shiites, and the problems between our Palestinian and Syrian brothers, each one is caught in a conflict. This conflict fills them with ideas, biases, and emotions, and all of this has its effect on them. Certainly, I, as an Egyptian, cannot feel the same anguish that a Syrian feels. The same is true for Palestinians, and the Syrian certainly won't feel the same anguish that a Palestinian feels. It's perfectly natural. A Islamic nation has gone through trials and tribulations. There were disagreements among the companions, wars, Kharijites, revolutions, political differences, and the transition from the rightly guided caliphate to oppressive monarchies. People were involved in these disputes, conflicts, and struggles. Some were sincere. Among them are the righteous who were overcome by emotion, the liars, and the exaggerators. Perhaps two people witness the same story, and perhaps both are truthful, but one saw one scene and the other another, or one sees this incident as pivotal while the other sees it as insignificant, just as happens in our lives when these people recount and relate. We are presented with differing viewpoints. Different accounts have emerged, and we are presented with different and even contradictory narratives. This is true of all historical events. The people who were present and witnessed these events each transmitted them according to their own perspective, whether influenced by intellectual or sectarian biases, personal agendas such as flattering or harboring animosity, or weaknesses in memory and accuracy. All of this occurred in our history. Consequently, our history as humans was transmitted by humans, with all the inherent human flaws. What is our advantage? Our advantage lies specifically in the early Islamic period. We sought to establish the integrity of the religion and to verify what was narrated about the Prophet in the rightly guided caliphs. To ascertain these truths, scholars rose to examine each narrative, who narrated it, what their biases were, who they followed, who they favored, what their role in the conflict was, who heard from them, and who heard about them. Therefore, the existence of authentic, weak, and fabricated accounts within our history is a strength, not a weakness. With other histories, you cannot definitively say what is authentic, weak, or fabricated. You simply cannot. But you have found the machine that sorted our history into authentic, fabricated, weak, acceptable, and doubtful. All of this exists. This is a great scholarly work, and more than that, Sheikh Murad ibn Sirin's famous saying is, people used to narrate hadiths from the Messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him. But when the strife occurred, it was said, name your men for us. This is no longer acceptable after the disagreement and the conflict. If you say, the Messenger of God said, someone will ask you, who told you this on the authority of the Messenger great scholarly work done by the Muslims, the chain of transmission isnad, the index of men, the classes, and the science of criticism and authentication. This system didn't just help us know the narrations, but it served us greatly in many other ways. We learned about the narrations that spread in the Levant, the narrations that spread in Yemen, the narrations that spread in Iraq, and the narrations that spread in the Hijaz, because we have an index of the narrators who said them. So we know what the dominant culture is, what the prevailing idea is now among the people of Iraq or among the people of the Hijaz. The scholars of the Levant, or even those of the Hijaz, have become so well versed in each branch of Islamic sciences that we now know what these groups were interested in. This is one of the most important details of our history. For example, consider the Meccan school of thought. There's a book called Tafsir al-Tabi'in, Interpretation of the Followers by Sheikh Muhammad al-Qudari, may God release him from captivity. In this book, he compiled the interpretations of the followers Tabi'in, the interpretations transmitted from them, and began analyzing them. He discovered that the group in Mecca, the Meccan school of interpretation, were very distinguished in the rulings of Hajj. Why? Because they were always asking questions about Hajj. People would come to them with questions. Similarly, the scholars of Basra were distinguished in the field of language. The school of interpretation in Basra focused on language because they were closer to the Bedouin and could consult the Bedouin who were familiar with classical Arabic. Consequently, they were better equipped to provide linguistic interpretations. The scholars of the Levant were distinguished in matters of jihad because the Levant was a land of jihad and its scholars were more influential, and his firmness in the rulings on jihad, and so on. So I'm telling you how we know this from the indexes of narrators and their narrations and so on. Of course, this applies to modern history, Professor Muhammad. No, it doesn't apply to modern history. Of course, it doesn't apply. So how can we in modern history distinguish between the weak, the fabricated, and the authentic? It's a disaster. Yes. What is it? When you talk about the time of Islamic dominance and the establishment of its scientific traditions, it's different from when you talk about foreign dominance and the establishment of foreign occupation and westernization. This is one situation, and that is another. Sheikh, now in modern history, you are in a very difficult situation, truly, because those who wrote modern history, you can't. I want to tell you, find a historian in the mold of al-Harbi, Ibn Kathir, and al-Tabari, for example, whose ability to compile piety, religion, and accuracy I trust. I can hardly find one. He certainly exists, but if you say now, who is the equivalent of Ibn Kathir? Who is the equivalent of al-Harbi? Who is the equivalent of al-Tabari? Who is the equivalent of Ibn al-Athir? Who is the equivalent of Ibn Khaldun? We are forced to compare different accounts. For example, you have the October War. You have the 1967 war. You have the Al-Aqsa flood. You come to the heart of this war with the different narratives of each side, each party. In the 1967 war, for example, you come with the weak voices from the Israeli side, from the Syrian side, from the Egyptian side, from the researchers in the British archives, the researchers in the American archives, and you gather all of this and try to extract the truth from all of this, or what can be extracted from the truth. This is what you resort to now in reality, and what serves now, even though we have lost the support and lost religion and piety. What serves now is the abundance of archives, press archives, local press and international press, as well as what is released from foreign archives, British, American, and others. Of course, there are countries that never release their archives. You have Egypt and Syria, they never release their archives, and the information available from foreign sources is not higher than the information available from local national sources, but all of this, in reality, does not reach the level of trust. The precision and accuracy that characterized our Islamic history is why, in this context where we discuss our Islamic history, I am trying to draw people's attention to the fact that this history, as written using
بل يزيد دقة وضبطا وديانة.
Scientific methodology and approach is no less and in fact more accurate, precise, and religiously sound than contemporary written history. This contemporary history, which you perceive as scientific, methodological, and written in university theses, is subject to change. What prevents us from having the same tools, the same methodology, and the same environment? I mean, we are now in the modern age, but with progress and advancement, we are defeated. We have lost control over our homelands. But as a historian, I want a historian at an Egyptian, Syrian, or Gulf university who can write the history of the Arabian Gulf as it was, and not write the history of Abul Fattah al-Sisi as it was, nor the history of Hafiz al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad as it was. Al-Tabari could have narrated the virtues or vices of the Abbasids while he was under their rule. He could have done so, but who now he can do that? I know a historian who is currently imprisoned. May God release him. He tried to write the modern history of the Islamic world, and while he was looking for researchers and funding, someone told him, this is a political project, not a historical one. You want to write the modern and contemporary history of Islamic countries, meaning you want to say how these countries were divided, how these regimes were installed, and who brought them on. You men, I mean, I don't want to give examples. I don't know where your red line is. Let me give an example. We Egyptians have a bit of freedom. For example, the October 1973 war. All Egyptians believe that they won this war. If you read foreign sources, you'll see that opinions differ on this war. Either Israel won, or it ended in a stalemate. Only the Egyptians believe that they won, and this is the truth. The truth is that the war ended either in a stalemate or with an Israeli victory. A war ended with Israel having the upper hand. This is something every researcher of this war knows, except for the Egyptians here. There are other countries, I won't name them, but everyone who studies history knows that this country was founded on a fabricated revolution created by foreigners. The foreigners themselves orchestrated it, and the memoirs of those who orchestrated it are published, as are the memoirs of those who managed it, and the memoirs of those who researched it. Only the people of this country remember it as a glorious and genuine revolution. History is a narrative written by humans, and these humans exist within a specific environment with its own balance of power. A dominant political power, especially when it is oppressive, has an impact. For example, an American can write a critique of American history, and a Briton can write a critique of British history because they have political power. They have a margin of freedom for this writing, but the narrower this margin becomes, the less they can do, and that's why our academic standing declines. You're asking me why we can't do that. We can't because you don't have that freedom. It is the mother from which all human creativity springs. You cannot find a person who does not possess the necessary skills/knowledge. I mean, do you want someone to write a research paper and then end up in prison, for example, or in the afterlife? How can such a person write a research paper? Therefore, as long as we are not empowered by our homelands and our countries, the scientific situation will remain weak, and that is why in reality in our present era, foreign production in general is better than Arab and Islamic production, even though we Muslims are more capable of writing our Islamic history than foreigners because we are the children of the land, the region, the language, and the culture, but we are unable. I always give the example of a book like Thomas Haighammer's The Caravan, a book about Sheikh Abdullah Azam, may God have mercy on him. Thomas Haighammer is a researcher in the security field and in the field of Islamic movements. He spent 10 years writing this book, going to every place Abdullah Azam had set foot in and meeting everyone he could reach, whom Abdullah Azam had met. And of course, he read the works of Abdullah Azam produce this book. I want to tell you that no Muslim researcher could do this, even if they had the money, although money is a big deal. Funding research for 10 years is a huge undertaking. Who these days can support a researcher for 10 years to produce just one book? No one. But even if they had the money, let me say even if they had the security to go to Israel, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and America, if you were a researcher and wanted to go all that way, you'd be stopped at so many airports, need so many visas, and you'd go crazy. Yes, it's true that foreign production in general is better than Arab and Islamic production. The main reason is the current political situation in the Muslim world. This oppression, this tyranny, and the lack of freedoms, all of this stifles potential and capabilities. Even if I were sitting at home writing, imagine someone he wants to document what happened in Syria, or what happened in Libya, or what happened in the last Gaza war, or any major events that happened. I'm at home and I want to write, and I also want to show that, for example, in the media sphere, some media outlets played a good role, and others played a dirty or negative role, and so on. I want to document all of this. What's stopping me? Nothing's stopping you, but the narrative will still be very incomplete because I have to go. You have to go, and you have to meet eyewitnesses. For example, sometimes when the British archives are released, for instance, and a document from a particular year is published, you find people rushing to those archives to see what happened in their country, or America, or elsewhere. Sometimes a document is released that overturns the established narrative because it reveals things that happened behind the scenes, things the media doesn't see. So, you, right now, have the media, and you're sitting in front of social media, sitting in front of the internet, or watching satellite channels. These are just the margins. These are the facades. This is the final outcome. But how was the agreement reached? For example, by the active parties involved. Sometimes, you only discovered this after the fall of Hosni Mubarak. Let me also give the example of the Egyptian regime. The Egyptian regime under Hosni Mubarak was considered one of the most open Arab regimes. There was freedom of the media and freedom of the press, but as soon as the regime falls, you discover influential people in the corridors of power who were completely unknown to you. You didn't know them or hear about them. So, any history of the Hosni Mubarak era, for example, if you take it from the media, from newspapers, and from social media, will always be incomplete, missing important things. It's not missing anything, not just minor or trivial matters. So, to close this question and move on to the sixth question, to what point in history can we consider our history complete in terms of the narrative? And after that, no, we need to exert more effort when we read, we investigate more and study more. No, there isn't this dividing line. There isn't this dividing line. Depending on each period and each country, there's a scientific movement. You could say that there's an abundance of information that allows you to compare accounts and arrive at a true understanding. For example, a famous contradiction: Andalusia fell about 550 years ago, while the Ottoman Empire fell about 100 years ago. But logically speaking, shouldn't my knowledge be stronger about Andalusian history or Ottoman history? Because the Ottomans are more recent. Practically speaking, the opposite is true. Andalusian history is written in Arabic, and Ottoman history is written in Ottoman Turkish. The archives weren't opened until recently. Ottoman archives weren't made available for viewing until recently. So, the material available to you on Andalusian history is much larger, more comprehensive, and more abundant than the material available on Ottoman history. This means your ability to see a clear history of Andalusia is greater than the clarity of Ottoman history. This isn't just for us, by the way, but even for the Ottoman Turks. There's no archive. The archive is closed. Ottoman state still needs a higher degree of research and investigation to form a clearer picture, so there's no line you're referring to. Every case has its own circumstances. Okay, let's move on to question 6. Question 6 is a rather interesting question, and here I welcome the online trolls. Bring your blood pressure monitors with you because we'll answer this question for you. Yes, it's related. Many people tell us to beware of Orientalists because these Orientalists, my friends, have falsified Islamic history. So, who are these Orientalists? Why would they falsify our Islamic history? And if they did falsify it, what did they falsify? Yes, and so, the question can be asked in another way: is our Islamic history, my brother, falsified, or has it been subjected to falsification? Wow, what a complex question. Okay, let's take them one by one. First, who are the Orientalists? This is the first time I've heard the word Orientalists. I used to listen to Sheikh Sharawa's lectures. May God have mercy on him. It was one of our good habits in our house to listen to Sheikh Sharawa's lectures every Friday. This is one of the virtues that my parents, may God preserve them, instilled in us. Sheikh Sharawi would always say something, and then an Orientalist would come along and raise some doubts, and Sheikh Sharawi would respond and clarify them. I used to think that these Orientalists were a group that specialized in attacking the Holy Quran, criticizing it. When I was young, this was my perception of them, that these so-called Orientalists were a group that sat around the Holy Quran to find doubts in it. But when we grew up, we learned who the Orientalists were. They are Western non-Muslims who wanted to study the Islamic world. When did they start? What did they do? They started around the 14th century AD. There are books written about the history of Orientalism. We'll say it was in the 14th century AD, around 1300 AD, and I don't want to go into details about when shares of Orientalism originated in European universities, but we're talking about this in a podcast for the general public. So, without going into details, the Orientalist movement was sown by a group of Westerners who wanted to study Islamic sciences. This movement has earlier roots. Yes, it has earlier roots. Since the Muslim conquest of the Levant, for example, there were Christians in the Levant and Egyptian Christians who wanted to defend their Christian faith against this Islamic conquest. Islamic conquest itself led to the conversion of many people. Most people converted with the Islamic conquests, so some Christians and some Jews wanted to defend their religion, and from that early time they began trying to study Islamic sciences and criticize them in order to prove themselves and their people in their faith. And let's not forget that they were swept away by the wave of the Islamic conquest. Some of them, for example, carried out suicide operations, like the martyrs of Cordoba. It's a well-known phenomenon. Someone would come in front of people in the middle of, for example, the Great Mosque of Cordoba and insult the Prophet, peace be upon him. This is a kind of intellectual crisis. In their view, they were martyring in an attempt to halt the spread of Islam, because even people were learning Arabic and taking pride in it, boasting about it, reciting Arabic poetry. So, the study of Islamic sciences began long ago, with the very beginning of Islam, because some people wanted to confront Islam. But when did this movement transform into an organized scientific movement? We can say that from the 14th century, departments for the study of Arabic language and literature, or Oriental languages and literature meaning Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and so on began to emerge in European universities. When these people wanted to study, they wanted to study Muslims. What was their purpose? Originally, they wanted to study Muslim sciences, to learn from them, to understand them, and to ultimately triumph over them. All of this exists because these sciences first began with the Church and the early Orientalists
وولى كرسي البابوية في روما.
held the papal throne in Rome. Then we had people trying to study, translate, and understand. The number of departments that emerged in European universities increased, and so on. We have a wave of Westerners trying to study Islamic sciences. They went to Andalusia, studied. They went to Morocco, studied. They went to Egypt, studied. Then, when the political balance collapsed and European dominance over the Islamic world remained, the Europeans entered their second wave. Let me mention a simple point here. We can say that the waves of European invasion of Islamic lands were three. A first wave was the Crusades. This was a brutal military campaign with little scientific advancement. Therefore, when they came to our lands, they began to learn from us, to study from us, and even to learn about civilization, eating with spoons and clothing. All of this happened. The second wave, for example, you could say, began with the French campaign, or if you want to go back a bit, it began with the Spanish, followed by the British and French. The third and final stage is the American stage, which you could say began with the 2003 invasion of Iraq. So, the second stage, which began with the French campaign, or before that, the Spanish and Portuguese campaigns, was one of its distinctive feature, one of its novel aspects, is its reliance on scientific teams. These scientific teams are the Orientalists, people who came before these armies and with them remaining in our lands during the occupation or before it, and some even survived after it. Their mission is to study our traditions, customs, religion, culture, and sciences. That's what these Orientalists are all about. What do they study with their aim of bringing us down? It's a broad human movement, a very broad human movement. This broad human movement includes Orientalists who study to learn and understand, those who study to undermine us, and those who study to serve colonialism, pointing out weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Advanced spies. The situation itself encompasses all these types, from the adventurer who likes to observe and the researcher who likes to learn, to those who see themselves as soldiers of colonialism and occupation, writing war and military reports or cultural reports to submit to their countries to aid in the occupation and control of us. The situation itself includes every country. But generally speaking, Sheikh Murad, the one who stands out, controls, and dominates this situation, is the one who has political and military advantages by nature. For example, someone who goes to study Islamic arts tells me about their decorations, the types of stones, and the shapes of arches. That's not very important for a politician, but someone who goes to study verses and hadiths, pointing out flaws, weaknesses, or doubts that can be raised, someone who goes to study history, someone who goes to study fortresses, someone who goes to study the nature of this society and how it can be corrupted. That's the important figure. Therefore, during the era of Western supremacy, swarms of Orientalists preceded the Western armies. They came, studied, and settled in our lands, some staying and then leaving. During the occupation, their numbers increased even more because they were supported by the occupying power. So, these Orientalists, if we were to define them, are the Western group who wanted to study the Islamic situation and wrote about our history and our religion. Some specialized in exegesis, hadith, creed, and numismatics, Islamic culture, in inscriptions, arts, customs, and traditions. All of this exists. Some people converted to Islam, some were fair to those who didn't convert, but were treated justly, and some didn't convert and weren't treated justly. Each person's fate depends on what God intended for them and what good qualities they possessed. People are like precious metals in the end, but the most comprehensive and detailed thought is this vast heritage. For example, the
يعني مثلا الحملة الفرنسية اللي جت عندنا مصر بعد ما علماء
French campaign came to Egypt, and after the scholars of the French campaign produced an encyclopedia called Description of Egypt. This is truly the most accurate reference on Egyptian history at that time. This encyclopedia contains everything, from plants to animals to insects. Even the layers of the earth and architectural styles. They recorded all of this in their encyclopedia. They provided a tremendous amount of intellectual material related to our religion, culture, and traditions. That's the general situation. Now let's talk about the man who is asking. He's asking about Islamic history and whether Orientalists have distorted it. Firstly, most of what he wrote, Orientalists wrote it for their own people and in their own languages. They didn't write it for us, nor did they write it in our language. Most Orientalist output, 97-98%, in fact, was written in foreign languages. The writer didn't want to falsify our history for us. He wanted to present our image to his own people, to present it in any way possible. This is where the differences between Orientalists come in. Some wanted to distort the truth because it was a time of war. You know, for example, during the Crusades, Western production about Islamic history and about Muhammad, peace be upon him, began. But this production was full of lies and hatred. The first person considered to have established the distorted image of Muslims was named Dud Nanot. He was French, and I can't pronounce his name. Something like that. This man wrote a book about our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. But I swear, I don't have sources to write about Muhammad, but I wrote anything because no matter what I write or how much I insult him, Muhammad is worse than anything I could ever write. Oh dear God. So, someone with this mindset and mentality imagines what kind of book someone without sources can produce. He writes from his own head, and Hector, in this sense, harbors resentment within him. Therefore, Orientalist production, in reality, during the era of fear of Muslims and the Islamic world, was dominated by a deceitful, hateful, propagandistic tone that portrayed Muslims to Westerners as an imminent danger. However, in times and moments when the West seemed superior and was suffering a major defeat, analytical and fair Orientalist writings began to emerge. This is because they viewed you as a
وما عندكش مشكلة انك تقول الفراعنة عظماء. ليه؟ لانه الحضارة ميتة، انت مش خايف من الفراعنة. ولو قلت عظماء
civilization, this won't benefit or harm you.
ولا ينفعك ولا هيضرهم. فانت محتاج تفهم حقيقة.
You need to understand the reality of what the pharaohs were like. In our Islamic context, the more the Orientalist leaned towards and aligned himself with Western politics, and the more the Orientalist perceived Muslims as a threat, the more his work was saturated with hostility and hatred, even if sources were available to him. For example, the first man, Gaunt, whom we are talking about, didn't have sources, but the contemporary Orientalist has no sources. No, there are so many sources, but as the French Orientalist Maxime Rodinson says, medieval myths were revived with modern embellishments. How can you present lies in an academic and objective manner when the content or purpose remains the same? There are many, and when they came to specializing in Islamic history, some of them encountered more problems. Some Orientalists couldn't overcome their linguistic limitations. It's true they can read Arabic, they can read manuscripts, but they don't grasp the essence of Arab
المكتوب كما يفهمه العربي، فلذلك فهم خطأ وأعاد كتابة
Arab
التاريخ.
would. Therefore, they misunderstood and rewrote
ممكن
history
نقود ممكن يكون غلطان
incorrectly. They might be malicious, they might be mistaken, and their intention might be deliberate. You can discover this from the Orientalists' body of work. From the Orientalists' body of work, you can tell if this person is closer to fairness but makes mistakes, or closer to falsification and malice. They do this intentionally, or they do it intentionally with an error. This is understood from the overall body of the Orientalists' work. So, I mean to say that the Orientalist sometimes lacks a grasp of culture. Sometimes an Orientalist understands or reads Islamic history through Western eyes, as we mentioned in the example of Jules Zier. He sees a scholar in the Sultan's court, and this scholar narrates a hadith in the Sultan's favor. So, he immediately concludes that the scholar narrated it for the Sultan's benefit, when this is not the case. This is because the Orientalist possesses a cultural background derived from his own intellectual environment and historical context, leading him to understand things that are not present in our Islamic world. This Orientalist may have an intellectual or ideological perspective. For example, he might be a materialist, a Marxist, a communist, or someone who believes that economics drives life. When he reads our Islamic history, he reads it through the lens of his ideology and intellectual perspective, resulting in a distorted history because he doesn't understand that the economic factor was not the most important factor influencing the history of Muslims. Orientalists have erred to this extent. Some wanted to falsify history, some misread it, some misunderstood it, and some couldn't rid themselves of their own ideologies, thus coloring our Islamic history accordingly. European, Western, and Russian history, which aligns with his ideology, is colored by it. Consequently, our Orientalist output is marked by a number of flaws. Does this mean that all their work is flawed? No, in fact, many Orientalists produced works of immense power, brilliance, and greatness. Works upon which subsequent authors, including Muslims, remained dependent. This is because many Orientalists possess perseverance, patience, research, and meticulous investigation of manuscripts, resulting in truly magnificent works. Some names have shone brightly in the firmament of Islamic history and thought, even if they made mistakes. For example, I want to mention a book like the Dictionary of Genealogies and Ruling Families by the Austrian Orientalist Zenbauer. It's a monumental work that explores the entire Islamic world, indexing its rulers, princes and ministers, their reigns and the periods of their rule. It's a truly beautiful index. Another example is the Eastern Caliphate countries, or Baghdad, capital of the Caliphate by Kulstrung. There are also books like Stanley's Paul wrote about Islamic coinage and about Egyptian history, as did Prachtvisky, the famous Russian historian, in his book on the history of literature and geography. Of course, I can't recall all their works right now, but I want to say that some Orientalists produced incredibly powerful and magnificent works, and world knowledge owes them a debt of gratitude. Sometimes I even say that it was a blessing from God that some of these Orientalists came at a time when the Islamic world was weak and didn't appreciate knowledge as it should have been. They took manuscripts from our lands to their libraries, catalogued them, edited them, printed them, and thus preserved them from being lost. They truly deserve credit for this. I know that some scholars and historians don't like this, but I also know that others do. For example, I remember one of our professors, may God preserve him, saying, when I was little, I used to see my mother throwing manuscripts left by some of my ancestors into the oven to bake bread, not realizing their value, and I saw some vendors using manuscripts they found in their grandfather's closet, selling them around lube and peanuts and stuff. He doesn't know, well, which was better for them to take it, preserve it, and verify it, even if they were our enemies, even if their intentions were bad. that they took what they could, even if, of course, they took some of it by theft, some by deception, and some, I mean, there were criminals among them, not all of them. I mean, they were sincere to science and knowledge. No, some of them took it by theft, some by manipulation and deception, and some from people who didn't know its value, and some of them took it from libraries, meaning they took it from places where it was preserved and not neglected and degraded. Yes, but like any human phenomenon, it has its advantages and its disadvantages. The falsification that Orientalists carried out, as I told you, sometimes stemmed from the Orientalists' intentions and sometimes from the Orientalists' lack of competence in understanding the Arabic text and Arabic culture. But where is the bigger problem than this? That these Orientalists, when they were present in foreign universities at the time when it began, the Arab world began sending its professors to foreign universities. Our children received Islamic history from Orientalists before they received it from scholars, and they didn't even read it in its original sources. This means a generation of pioneers emerged. A dangerous point. Yes, a generation of pioneers emerged, those who went to Europe and studied at European universities. The first time they learned about Islamic history, they learned it from Orientalists, and they were influenced by all their mistakes, cultural mistakes, scientific mistakes, mistakes stemming from a foreign perspective. Reading and reproducing Orientalist books became easier for them than returning to Islamic sources or reading them from an Islamic perspective. So now you have a class of pioneers who went and studied at Western universities and returned to establish Arab and Islamic universities. And during the times of occupation, we also started importing Orientalists to teach in two universities, Arab and Islamic. So you come to a period, the late 80s and 90s, for example, the late 19th and early 20th centuries up to the 1950s, a period of 80 to 90 years, were a time of dominance for Orientalist narratives over Islamic history. A book might have been written by a Muslim, born and raised as a Muslim, but the Orientalist perspective would still be prevalent. When did people and scholars begin to challenge Orientalism? We can say they started in the 1920s and 1930s, but those who challenged Orientalism were marginalized by the regimes and the occupying powers, so their voices were weak and
اللي بيحاول يقاوم المستشرق ده ما بيعرفش بيكتب فين بينشر فين
their resources limited. While Orientalists taught at Cairo University, the American University in Cairo, the American University in Beirut, and were sent to Baghdad University, and so on. Those who tried to challenge this Orientalist didn't know where to write or publish. The means at their disposal were extremely limited. This is how Orientalist dominance over the narrative of Islamic history began, and consequently, many doubts arose. This is the basis of the warning our friend mentions, that Orientalists falsified Islamic history in this way, which I explained in the short story. I've gone on too long. In response, no, on the contrary, even if we listened to you until morning, Professor Muhammad, we wouldn't get bored or suffer from any kind of boredom. But the point is that this feeling crept into us when these books, written in their language for their people, began to arrive, and then we translated them. Yes, and when we tried to compare them, we felt there was a big difference. So we're talking about falsification, which isn't intentional, but there is an Orientalist movement that deliberately falsified. I mean deliberately falsified, not that we can say that there is something I don't mean deliberately falsified, meaning that the Orientalist wanted to see the truth and deliberately contradict it. No, I don't want to say this phenomenon is rare, but the reason it's rare is because if the Orientalist's goal was to incite Western nations against Muslims and he felt threatened, he might do it. When I offer a recommendation to the political leadership, I'm not going to distort reality for them. He's currently on a scientific mission to study this society. It's not in his interest to present them with a false image. He's serving his people so they can plan accordingly, and besides, he's not alone. There are
فالتزوير بمعنى إرادة
Many Orientalists, distortion in the sense of deliberate and
هذه ظاهرة
obvious error is a
لكن التزوير اللي حصل حقيقة هو في
rare phenomenon, but the real distortion lies in the overall view of the Islamic world, where
في إنه يتلون
words are misunderstood and colored by
أما الاتكاء على ما يوجد في
sectarian bias. There's also reliance on weak and fabricated historical accounts. Is the Orientalist too scientifically qualified to distinguish between authentic and weak narrations?
تاريخ الطبري
When a Muslim scholar reads al-Tabari's history and hears
أبو
Abu Lut said,
لوط بن يحيى أبو مخنف وقال أبو مخنف
Abu Lut ibn Yahir, Abu Miknaf said, and Abu Miknaf said, Lut ibn Yahir, the Muslim scholar familiar
أبو
with the hadith books knows that this Abu Lut is the father of Abu Miknaf, Lut ibn Yahir, a
هو عارف
Shiite liar and a narrator of hadiths, is knowledgeable and therefore understands the weight of narrations. But the Orientalist, Abu Lut, Abu Miknaf, is like al-Zuhri, who is considered the most trustworthy of trustworthy narrators. Therefore, whoever wants to create a distorted image finds in fabricated and weak narrations what they can use to create an image that suits their taste and desires,
الحديث
because they are too weak scientifically to delve into the science of hadith
يعني برضو
and understand it. Of course, they also developed meaning. Keep in mind, these Orientalists are not all of one mind, they also developed. They later learned that there is a science of hadith, they learned that there are classes, biographies, and men, and they began to correct their work. Some of them respond to each other. Some say to him, you didn't understand, and some say, no, he didn't come across such and such manuscript of such and such book. It is a scientific situation with all scientific interactions. Okay, 3 quick things because the episode is over, so just a quick ping pong. Okay, should we take from the Orientalists? We read about their achievements, but most of what they excelled at wasn't related to culture. I mean the dictionaries they compiled, the encyclopedias they created, things like that require diligence, research, and compilation. Orientalists excelled in those areas. Things related to culture, especially interpretation, hadith, jurisprudence, and language have many problems. There's something better, and of course, you should consider your sources. Yes, the professors you mentioned, thinkers, scholars, whoever they may be whose initial exposure to Islamic history or sciences was in Europe. Yes, is this an important criterion for me to ask myself? Who am I learning from now? Someone who studied in Europe or in our Islamic and Arab countries? No, I can't give a general rule because even the responses of those influenced by Orientalists varied. Some were deceived and absorbed their ideas, some were aware that they didn't understand, and some were skilled at refuting them. These types exist, so you understand them too. I'm telling you, this is a field of knowledge, so you need to ask specialists. Ahmed Aman is different from Tahir Hussein, Mahmoud Shaker, and Muhammad al-Azrami. Each of them has a different rate of response and reproduction of Orientalist thought, or a different way of refuting it. Yes, the overall work of this author helps us understand that when a Westerner comes to us, we call him an Orientalist. Yes, when a Muslim or Arab goes to the West to study them, what is he called? And some people are trying, in recent times, to establish a science of Occidentalism to counter Orientalism. But of course, this cannot happen. There are attempts, and someone like Dr. Mazal Mutakarni is still working on it. I have a book titled Towards an Islamic Foundation for the Science of Occidentalism. How do we study the West? There are attempts in a journal published in Beirut about the science of Occidentalism, but truly, this will not happen unless we become a strong nation, capable of sending waves of people, not just 1, 2, 3, or 4. So, if you are talking about a name they call the Occidentalist, then that concludes the second episode of the 100 Questions in History series with Professor Muhammad Al-Harmi. We stopped at question 6 in the episode. Next, we will begin with question 7, God willing. May God grant us success. To watch more programs about Islamic history, to learn about its events, victories, defeats, leaders and scholars, its secrets, governance, politics, wars, and battles, simply follow our YouTube channel, Our History. Our history stretches from the furthest point in the past to the furthest point in the